But thank you for having me here. I'm sorry I'm a woman saying this, but I've been told reliably from men who research violence generally that they couldn't say what I say as a man. So until things change, it's going to be women. That was better. So if you can't hear me, wave. Okay, so you can find it there. Right, go on. And go to conferences. Dublin. And the one that says Dublin. Not this one, so I should get it. Okay. Yes. Okay, I've got my email on there. Obviously, you can keep my slides and they can put on the website. So if you do want to contact me, do so. So just to say, Ireland's actually really quite good for violence against women, and the fact that we've got really low rates. I don't know if that's ever said by organisations that are interested in domestic abuse, but actually that's a European study of self-reports of women, and they actually reported the lowest rates in Ireland. So well done, Ireland. Let me just start this. Next one. So we talked about this already, really, but essentially you actually brought in a Domestic Violence Act. Next one. And what it says is, it's abuse of one person or another within a family environment, regardless of gender. And I was like, whoa, great, fantastic. Next slide. But then I read the Istanbul Convention, so that always worries me. I went to Turkey a few years ago. I was asked to come and give a talk about 212, and it was around this, and I gave an evidence-based talk and was met with very confused faces, generally. So I got the feeling that what I was saying wasn't what they were looking for, and they chose to ignore it completely. Next one. But essentially what we're looking at here is that violence, domestic violence, is gender-based violence, i.e. men hit women, and that's what domestic violence is, that's the first premise. And secondly, they do it because they're women. Not because you're in a relationship, because they're women. That is the definition. Sorry, I'm clicking my fingers, that's very rude.
Okay. That one's blank.
Just keep doing it. There you go. I normally do it myself. So, if a government discriminated, detained, and ultimately murdered 3 million women and girls, would this be gendered violence? Probably. Are we all right with that? Yeah? But would it be gendered violence if, at the same time, they also imprisoned and murdered 3 million boys and men? No. So this is Richard Felson's analogy where he's talking about the Holocaust. But if we only talked about the women who were imprisoned and murdered, it would look like gender-based violence. But if we looked at everybody and what proportion of those were women, then we would get a different picture. Next slide. So, that which is provable ought not to be believed in science without proof. So I'm a scientist, soft science obviously, nothing like a physicist, far too tricky. However, I've lost my mic.
Press the bottom of it. Press the bottom.
Alright, let me see. Does that work?
No. Hold it for a few seconds. Just see the green light come on.
Okay. Is that working? No. I'll hold that, it's fine. Okay, next slide. So, what is the research evidence that we're meant to be looking at? So, I came to this area as a feminist, looking to understand why men hit women. So this was all a bit of a learning curve for me when I actually went and looked at the literature, and I was privileged to work with a professor called John Archer. Thank you. And he said, look, women hit men too, and I said, I don't think they do. And he said, go away and prove it. So I went, and 25 years later, I'm still here. So John Archer has been a fantastic name. It's gone in. It's all right. Domestic violence research and general aggression. He is a world-leading aggression researcher. He was president of the big organisations. Everywhere we go, he's always like an absolute star. He did a meta-analysis in 2000, which I helped collect the data for, which is looking at every piece of research and putting it into one big sort of calculation. So approximately 60,000 men and women's reports. And what he found was men and women use domestic violence at about the same rates. Even if you look at severe acts such as beating, punching, kicking, you still find similar rates. But I sort of know this slide, I can do it on the line. In that first study, there was quite a lot of college samples because students do questionnaires. So a challenge for more feminist orientated domestic violence researchers was that that wasn't really representative of the samples. So he did a population survey, he looked at all population data from normal people like you and me living in normal houses and replicated the finding. And interestingly, what he found was in Western nations there was parity, or women were more aggressive than men. I don't know why I'm still holding that here. And indeed, as gender empowerment went up, so more women in parliament, less wage differential, men's violence went down and women's violence went up, which was still not better. I can get my laptop otherwise. Following on from John's 2006 meta-analyses, there's a raft of longitudinal studies, so they're really good studies because what happens there is you will follow a cohort of babies being born, say 1,000 babies in New Zealand, and you'll interview those people, their parents, friends and everything every 3 years, for years and years and years. And they're really reliable. You can really say what causes what. And they find the same thing. They find pretty much equal numbers of men and women using violence towards each other. Right, this don't move, this stay there forever. And indeed, from the very first study that ever asked about how many times you pushed, slapped, punched, kicked, beat your partner, so actually not saying domestic violence, saying how many times have you done this, from that very first study in the late 60s, they found parity, they found equal numbers. Murray Strauss, who did that first study, didn't publish that data for almost 10 years because he just couldn't believe it. And pretty much every study since then that has asked men and women the same questions, sampling fairly, so they're all in the population or they're all in services, but not comparing one with the other, finds men and women pretty much similar rates of domestic abuse. If you only ask women what they do and what their partners do, women say pretty much the same thing. If anything, we say we use a little bit more. So, next slide. Now, a good challenge to that is, why should we believe this? Because men are more violent outside the home. And indeed, men are more violent outside the home, but men are more violent outside the home towards men. They're not violent outside the home towards women. They don't go out on a Saturday night and beat women up. They go out and fight each other. And this is a really excellent longitudinal study. So they've been following this cohort for about 40 years now. And what we know is, when it's above, it means that they're higher. So men are higher in teacher and parent reports of aggression when they're little boys. They're higher in self-reports of violent offending. They're higher in informant reports. So if you ask for people who's the most aggressive in your class, it's boys. Convictions, it's boys. Self-reported domestic violence, switches, it's girls. Partner reported, girls. Clinically significant, so this is where the police were called, where agencies were involved, no significant difference. These are the same people. So it shows us boys are more violent to boys. Boys are more violent to men, are more violent to men. That doesn't translate into violence in intimate relationships. And you hear maybe a lot about dating violence. We've had quite a few campaigns and videos of boys taking my girlfriend's phone and throwing it away, and all this, again, framing it at boys hurt girls. We've got campaigns in England around this. But actually, all the research that asks boys and girls, same questions, finds that samples, girls typically self-report more aggression to boys than boys to girls. And most of the aggression in relationships is bi-directional, so both partners are using aggression. And actually, this is a systematic review in 2012 of all research on this, and you find that for the last column there, male to female, bi-directional aggression is pretty much the most common type. If one person is using aggression, the other person often is too. But interestingly, if you look at the female to male versus male to female column here, you'll see in population surveys, community samples, school and college samples, so these are all your general populations, women are using more violence than men. Where you've got a female clinical sample, so a refuge or mental health facility, you'll see similar rates, and the only time you'll see a big difference is men who are literally in treatment for partner violence, so domestic violence perpetrators found, the victim and so forth. And that's where you'll see some difference. Next slide. And if it was all about gender, why would we see exactly the same patterns in same-sex relationships? Because we do. We see gay and lesbian couples tend to report similar rates, similar occurrences as heterosexual couples. And indeed, if you look at gay, lesbian and heterosexual, lesbian couples are the most violent couples of the whole lot. So it doesn't suggest it's something about the man necessarily that's driving, or the man's attitude to a woman that drives this. Now, coercive control is coercive control is also now against the law in your country and in England too. I have spent a lot of time researching this. It was my PhD undergraduate project. And I personally do not agree it should be against the law. I'm very concerned about it. I led the British Psychological Society submission on this, but the panel, the people who contributed with me, felt it should, and so we had to recommend it. Many of the things that are coercive, when we get to threats and so forth, they're already criminal offences. But regardless, it is an offence. And it actually became a thing when researchers who didn't like this idea that men and women both use violence said, well, actually, men and women might both use violence, but men are coercively violent because they're patriarchal. They believe they have the right to be the boss of the household, and therefore they'll use violence and coercion to get their own way. And that's where I came in, as a feminist researcher of domestic violence. Domestic violence. I feel like we're haunted. I said to John Archer, this is it then. I said, the reason that the levels are equal is we're just talking about low level stuff, but it's men who are coercively violent. And he said, prove it. And I said, I will. And I trotted off and started doing some research. That's the feminist model, this power and control wheel. And again, when I say feminists, I'm talking about the feminists who research domestic abuse, and I do know them. This is a model I thought fantastic, created a questionnaire based on that model, and started asking people what they did. So, next one. No sex differences. So, men and women report similar rates of coercive control. Even at the high end of severely coercive behaviour, men and women are pretty equal. I found that in my undergraduate, my postgraduate, my PhD studies. I found it with my own students. LaRoche analysed Statistics Canada, 24,000 men and women, found the same thing. Myself and a research student, Liz Bates, we analysed a different data set, found the same thing. We found it again in 2013, and you find it in same-sex relationships. Again, it's not an answer. It's not a thing that we can hide in saying actually it's different for men and women. It just doesn't seem to be different. And again, coercive control is predominantly bi-directional. People who are coercive, not all of them obviously, but a lot of couples who have coercion, they're both quite coercive. People, although people like to think opposites attract, birds of a feather often do stick together. So in a proportion, probably let's say 50% of relationships where there's high coercion, it'll be bi-directional. And then you'll probably have 25% where you've got a non-coercive partner with a very coercive partner, and vice versa. So if gender is gender-based violence, if it isn't that, what's driving it? Well, the normal things that we know in criminal justice that drive other problematic behaviour. So like adverse childhood experiences. Have you heard about this in Ireland? It's everywhere in England at the moment. Everybody's talking about ACEs, and it's a really positive move forward. So adverse childhood experiences include being exposed to domestic abuse, living with a parent with mental health problems, being sexually, physically, emotionally abused as a child, having an incarcerated family member, I don't think there's any others, living with mental health problems, these types of things. So for each additional adverse childhood experience, the risk of being a perpetrator of domestic abuse in adulthood increases, and it looks very similar for men and women. And I could put multiple graphs up here with the ACEs, and for each additional ACE you'll see increases in substance use, you'll see increases in self-harm, you'll see increases in suicidal behaviour, increases in lots and lots of problematic behaviour. So it suggests that violence in the home doesn't come from the fact that I'm a man and that's a woman and I'm targeting her because of my patriarchal beliefs in that I should be the boss of the family. It's actually driven by far more mundane things in some ways, in the fact that it's driven by things that drive other types of criminal behaviour. So systematic reviews of longitudinal studies. So these are ones, you're not asking a perpetrator who sat in front of you, were you abused as a child? Because you could say, well, we're going to say yes, aren't we? So these are longitudinal. These are studies that followed them from childhood. So the reports are ones that we knew already before the violent behaviour happened. Child and adolescent abuse, family of origin risk, child-adolescent behaviour problems. So you have abuse in childhood, you have problems of the child during school and adolescence, then you have often emerging problems with criminal justice system or near misses, and you have violence in relationships. So it's not about gender, it's about childhood, adolescent factors and predicting DV perpetration and victimisation. And these are the factors we should be targeting if we want to intervene. Same thing, again, I could substitute domestic violence and general violence. Increased risk of ever being physically violent to a partner amongst men if you've had depression, 3 times more likely to be violent to a partner. Generalised anxiety disorder, 3 times. Panic disorder, 2.5 times. Women, pretty much the same. 2 times depression, 2.5 times anxiety, 1.9 panic disorder. So it's not being driven by this sort of cold-blooded need to control a partner. It's actually been driven by a lot of distress, a lot of poor emotional management. And I don't even mean to say poor emotional management, because the problem with trauma is it actually sets up a system neurocognitively where you respond very quickly to threat. Your emotions go from 0 to 10 really, really quickly. And at 10, we all do bad things. Nobody else is good at 10. So if you get to 10, you're going to be doing things which you wouldn't be proud of the next day. Our client base who have been traumatised as children don't start at 0 though, they start at 5 because they have a threat system which is higher to start with. They tick over higher. So they have less flex. So something that takes you from 0 to 5 takes them from 5 to 10. So they respond quicker, they respond higher, and therefore you get these are other symptoms that we're going to see. I'm sort of labouring the point now, I feel. So, yeah, so what we need to be doing as clinicians with individuals or couples is treating, certainly you can criminalise the offence, but then when you want to treat the people, you need to take a more mental health approach rather than a criminal justice approach. And interestingly, if you're only going to treat one member of a couple, longitudinal research might suggest that women's prior antisocial behaviour and depressive symptoms predict both their own abusive behaviour as well as their partner's abusive behaviour. Notably, the woman's characteristics were predictive over and above the contribution of her male partner, antisociality. So, if anything, there's maybe the women drive this slightly more than men, for reasons we will talk about. And this is Irish data, and this explains why, as partner violence in a population goes up, so does general violence. They're not driven by different factors. Societal factors that increase general violence, such as in the UK we've got austerity, so frontline services are disappearing, there's no support for people, so people are struggling with mental illness and homelessness and so forth, and these stresses create problems which cause aggression in the home, but they also cause aggression outside the home. That's why we see this relationship. So domestic violence isn't special, it's just like other violence and other problematic behaviour that we would treat in a completely different way. So this isn't to say that there aren't differences between men and women, and there are, and we will go through a few of them now. So, women are far more likely to be subject to sexual assault. That difference is larger for adult women. For children, boys and girls, the difference isn't quite so big. But men are far, far more likely to be murdered than women. And men are far more likely to be assaulted than women. In fact, 80% of homicide victims are male. Which you'd be surprised not feeling that that is what we're seeing, considering the only time we really hear about gender and homicide is actually around women's murders. So if we go, and indeed, this is actually used against men. So if you hold in mind, only 20% of those murdered are women and 80% are men. Go to the next slide. So this is the sort of thing you'll see routinely. Every year, this is English sample because I found it very hard to find figures for men in Ireland. Just go back on that. Every year since 1991, a total of 42% of all women killed are killed by a partner, ex-partner, compared to 77% of men. What does that imply to you?
It implies that it's 6 times the rate for women when they're just messing with percentages to make it look.
Yeah. And they always do this. They do it in America, they do it in Canada, they do it in England, and they'll do it with you. You'll see this too. The point is women aren't very likely to be murdered. And so of the 20% of women who are murdered, 42% are killed by a partner. But men are way more. You've got 80% men target other men. Women target men as well. So you've got this massive bulk of men who are killed by other men. So the fair comparison is of those people murdered by their partner, what percentage are men and women, isn't it? That's the fair comparison. Because men are targeted by everybody. Everyone targets men. So you have to take out the male on male stuff, yeah? And the women targeting men generally. So we just look at relationships. 65% of those murdered are women and 35% men. Now in the UK that fluctuates, maybe 70%, 30%, sometimes it's as high as 80%, 20%. It's still a lot different to saying 7%, isn't it? That's how we can play with statistics to present data in a way that fits a message that we want to have. If you don't want to know the truth, and you have a bit of statistical knowledge, you can very easily do some really fancy stuff, or not very fancy stuff, and come up with data that's going to tell you. That's the lies, damn lies, and statistics. That's exactly what it's referring to. So, what we essentially do in society is we equate domestic violence with men's violence to women. So they're synonymous. They're the same thing. They're used interchangeably. And gender-based violence. They're all used and they're all the same terms. It's quite 1984 Orwellian, really. This old idea of manipulating language use so that concepts are not even possible. If domestic violence equals men's violence to women, then if men are abused in a relationship, that's something else then, isn't it? Because that's not what we've told. That relationship to the words is already formed. And even when there's research where they're looking at men and women, and this is Irish data again, even they could be just so blatant. I can only imagine that they don't understand what we're saying really in real life, like out loud. But we said, so we're looking at how to sort of decide whether or not you're a victim of domestic violence for their research purposes. And they said, however, the item on being pushed or shoved is one that could clearly range in seriousness from mindlessly or rudeness. I mean, it's not rude to be pushed or shoved, it's a criminal offence. If someone shoves you, you don't say, don't be rude, you say, that's an assault. Rudeness to more violent forms of behaviour. And since this is prevalent for men and women, including it as a domestic abuse could seriously compromise the validity of the measure if it's dominated by incidents of less severe nature. So what Watson and Parsons are trying to say here is, when we just did any physical aggression, men and women came out equal, and that's not good enough, because we know that domestic violence is male violence to women. So if we're not getting the right, we have to have it, that must be wrong. So we must take out the items that women use also, and we have to keep doing that until we get this disparity that we hope for. So we look at serious violence, and they normally use lifetime rates. Now anyone who does stats knows lifetime rates are not very reliable, because people are less accurate telling about what's ever happened versus what happened in the last 12 months. And the other thing with domestic violence is men are far more likely to remain in a domestic violence relationship. So if you have lifetime prevalence, women are more likely to have multiple violent relationships and men have one, because they stay for multiple reasons which we haven't got time to go into. So, next one. But even in spite of this, in spite of the shenanigans, this report had to say 29% of women, 26% of men suffer domestic abuse. That's including emotional abuse, physical abuse, equal levels. Now when we look at severe violence, they were able to look at lifetime rates and get the numbers a little bit more disparate. So we've got, this is their quote, in the region of 88,000 men and 213,000 women in Ireland have been severely abused by a partner at some point in their lives. Remember, keep the long one, that's the biggest difference, always look for the biggest difference. Well, at first glance, they say, the book seems to suggest that men and women experience similar levels of domestic abuse. But one must bear in mind that the impact and severity of the abuse experienced by women is much greater. Now, they're only looking at severe abuse. They've already taken out all the items that men were subject to. So that doesn't actually hold water. That said, severity of abuse experienced by women is much greater than that experienced by men, particularly in these severe cases. And then he said at the end, that said, men like women do deserve protection. Thank you! So you just like completely cherry-picked through the data to get a difference. Then you said, oh well, even doing that, we've still got we've still got like quite a substantial amount of men who are victims. We then say, oh, but it's not as bad for men, but men still need help. It's like so inconsistent. Next one. And actually, in their same report, so physical impact, women are more likely to be injured than men. So about 2/3 of those injured, when you look in research, are women and 1/3 are men. But they talk about the psychological impact as well. And what they had to say in their report was most of the differences between men and women are not statistically significant in terms of psychological impact. They're not different. But more women than men reported a loss of confidence or self-esteem, that's 30% versus 7%. Then they were forced to say, I can only imagine a reviewer said, hey, put that in, because it just jumps out of nowhere. On the other hand, more men than women reported an increased cautiousness relating to their partner or other potential partners. So they actually did say about that. So to me, it's like, why do you even need to keep saying men versus women, men versus women? Why can we not just look at victims of domestic abuse, perpetrators of domestic abuse? Who benefits from doing this? When they look similar in risk factors for perpetration, victimisation, and impacts look similar, why the big drive to make it a gendered issue? Well, it plays into several things, but certainly what we know is the media certainly has one narrative, and this is what you will see. And I had a little search of Irish papers before I came, and yeah, all the articles are coming up. Even on the Men's Day, it was a white ribbon campaign. I literally went, oh! I was like, for goodness sake, a white ribbon. So this tells the public, it tells you, me, it tells police officers, social workers, teachers, everybody, that domestic violence is this. These helpless, innocent, cowering women. So not even looking at the 50% of domestic violence where there's both people using aggression. The only thing we're given is that unilateral male to female aggression. And that is the consistent message. And numerous surveys have established that among the general public, college and students in the US and Canada, that's where most of the research is done, intimate partner violence perpetrated by males is perceived differently than violence perpetrated by females. So the campaigns both feed off that and feed into that. So you get this loop. Next one, please. So it's not really that surprising that men do not label domestic violence against them as an assault. And Terry Moffat, again, on that longitudinal study, asked the men about physical aggression within intimate relationships. And then she got somebody else to ask about criminal victimisation, so assault. And what they found was much higher rates of victimisation are revealed when you ask about relationships and violent acts than when you ask about criminal assault. So men do not see their domestic violence as an assault. Next one. And if you do report it, if you do see it as an assault, only 29% of women actually would report it to your police, but only 5% of men would. So when you look at the figures, where you're saying 88,000 versus 213, you've got to start wondering, what would that look like if we actually calibrated for this fact that people don't identify, men are far more less likely to identify it as abuse, and if you look at crime figures, far less likely to actually come forward and report it. And if it is reported, this isn't Irish data, but there's no reason to think it would be much different. Women are very unlikely to get arrested. So if there's no injuries when the police turn up, 1% of women get arrested. But if the same with men, if there's no injuries, 52% will be arrested at the door. If there's minor injuries, 23% of women get arrested, 81% of men will be arrested in the same situation. Women arrested for domestic violence are treated like victims. They're treated like victims by services, and they're treated like victims of academic literature. And it's no surprise, therefore, that female batterers, and I don't like the term, but it's the term they use in this research, are significantly more likely to express beliefs that it is acceptable to hit the male batterers. Because women are not told it's wrong. Women see in all the rom-coms, just next time you watch one, see how many times a guy is punched in the face, slapped, kicked in the balls, or something like that, by the female lead, you know, the one we're meant to like. You just couldn't, if you reverse the roles in rom-coms, it would not make any sense at all. You could not have the main guy in a rom-com punch a girl in the face, and then she has to go away and think about it and come back and apologise. The audience would be like, what is going on here? You know, it would be so confusing to them. So women think it's okay to hit men because that's what they're being told by the media and by agencies. And women externalise blame, well, he deserved it, he wouldn't do this, or he should have done that. And I work with women, and I've got daughters, and I'm a woman, and it's not a nice place to feel that everything is happening to you. It's far better for people who use violent behaviour to understand, if you're doing it, you need to help yourself stop doing it. So we don't allow women to actually get better if we always say you're the victim. We need to actually say you're a perpetrator, it's not a good way to be, let's help you change your ways like we will do with men. Safer Ireland, this was a depressing thing. So Resolve is a new dedicated legal information and advocacy service to support women's access to justice and the legal remedies soon to open under the Act. For women. But the legislation is gender neutral. So why is it for women? Why are you giving them a different, why are men not in that? Why is it, it's completely, honestly, someone needs to ask these people what the mindset is. Oh, and then Safe Ireland, recognising this might seem a little bit sexist, note, particularly more research is needed to understand the responses needed for men experiencing violence in relationships. Well, obviously, the access to justice and advocacy should be the same. And just go to Mankind. Mankind's been doing this work on the mainland for years and years and years. There's plenty of literature of what men need and help seeking. You can't just say there's nothing there. There you go. Got some existing there. Mankind has got a whole load of stuff for professionals. Every time a man in the studies by Denise Hines and Emily Douglas, every time a man who was a victim had a negative response from treatment providers, his chance of reaching clinical levels of PTSD increased significantly. This isn't just, you know, unfair. This is actually a mental health issue for men. So I'm just going to end on a quick discussion of power. I don't know, I have more time, I've got the time on. Go on then, next one. Men are more physically strong. And I can see these men in the room. You're all Goliaths, it's fantastic. And that is obviously the first thing. You think, man and a woman, of course it's going to be the man. It makes perfect sense, doesn't it? However, that's a bit hard to see, but what we know is men have a norm in the way of chivalry. And what that means is men seek to protect women, which is why I think maybe the legal system where they're saying, why are men bringing in these laws? Because they're white knighting. They're being chivalrous. They want to protect women. There's so many feminist domestic violence researchers that are men who want to protect all of women. I've heard them say it to me. One guy said it, I won't blame it because it's on camera, but he said, you know, I just want to protect women, and I'm not a violent woman, but I actually fell off into him in my face. It's like, get lost protecting me. He was like this big, a tiny little man. It's like, I could kick your ass. You know, there's no way you need to protect me. I can't believe it. As I'm not saying his name. What we know is, if you ask men and women, men reduce their violence when it's a female partner, women increase their violence. Real power, though, isn't in this. It's in the power to crush somebody. Isn't a physical thing. It's about what power you have. So why have I got Jimmy Savile there?
See power over
psychological power.
Did he commit crimes for centuries, decades, sorry? Yeah? Why did his victims not come forward? He's famous. And they thought they wouldn't be believed. Yeah. And indeed, the ones that did come forward were not believed, so it was right, they didn't believe it. Jimmy Savile is a tiny little man. Yeah. He didn't have any physical power. I mean, he could run away apparently because he did a lot of marathons, but he couldn't actually fight his way out of much, I don't feel. So the physical power was irrelevant. What he had was actual power, real power. So what power have this gendered conceptualisation of domestic violence got? They've got public opinion. That's a massive thing. And you know that. You know that's so important. Trust women. Why? I'm a woman. I lie as much as the rest of you. I live in a house full of women. We all lie just as much. We are not. To actually say trust women is an insult to me. Because it almost says, I'm too sweet and pure and like unicorn-esque to even lie. I'm some fragile being. No, I'm like you. I'm right enough to lie. I'm right enough to be mean. You shouldn't trust women because they're women, because that's sexist. You should trust somebody if they prove to be trustworthy and the facts support their version of events. But power is having public opinion. Well, power is also having the police. So if the police are being trained, like they are in England, in a feminist perspective, then we see what we expect to see. I could bore you with like hours of cognitive psychology that says if you prime somebody to see something, they'll see it. To a point that the Police and Criminal Evidence Act says you have to interview people really carefully to not plant memories and thoughts and interpretations that changes what they actually perceive as reality. You train your police force to see it as a problem of male patriarchy, male violence towards women. When they turn up at the door and she's shouting, he hit me and he's bleeding, they're going to say, right, you. Because she'll say, I pushed him and trying to get away. They're going to believe him 9 times out of 10. If it's a mutual violence, both people are doing it, they're going to nick the guy. 99 times out of 10. I've been that one up 99 times out of 10. Yeah, I'm good with that. 99 times out of 100. And you've got the state, the biggest thing. You have the judiciary, the courts and the laws all adopted and gendered. In the UK we have the Department of Women and Girls, end violence to women and girls, not boys to men. Nobody's even questioned that. Can you imagine having something like end violence to white people? You'd be like, what do you mean just white people? Or end violence to young people? Well, why don't we want to end violence to older people too? When you've got that level of power, it doesn't matter if you're stronger. It's irrelevant. It's like saying that a police officer is like you've got all these like hardlands on the pavement on a Saturday night. Why do the police run around with, I mean, in England, we run around with no guns? Why are they not getting killed, kicked, beaten up and so forth? Because they have the power of the state. If you bother the police, you're going down. That's what women have got. We've got the power of all of this behind us. And this is real power. 39 minutes. I'm going to finish really quick. Yeah, that's right. What we know is when women use this, it really increases PTSD and depression in men. Threatening it or actually doing it is associated with higher levels of distress and problem behaviour in the children. And they're saying that actually you should look for this legal administrative coercive control for male partners and their children, and if that's happening they should be referred for mental health support. And men in criminal justice system report they are guilty until proven innocent. They are a victim but cast as a perpetrator. Their masculine identity is used against them, and the psychological impact is minimised. So we're told your abuser is only as strong as your silence. Unfortunately, that's not the case, because it doesn't much matter if you do go forward, because you're less likely to believe, you'll be framed as a perpetrator, and so forth. I think power is being able to say complete and utter nonsense and have it believed. Powerlessness is where no matter how much cogent evidence and proof you have, you won't be believed. And we'll end on this. Doubt is an uncomfortable position, and your job is to create doubt in the people you know around you, and they won't like it because we don't like doubt. But anybody who's certain about this, who hasn't spent years doing research, they're in a ridiculous position. You need to point that out to them. You cannot be certain unless you've done some research. You cannot trust the media. Everyone knows that. And you can't trust politicians. And you certainly shouldn't trust somebody whose job it is to provide a service, needs that service to. You shouldn't trust what they say. I wouldn't trust Apple to tell me that I have to have an Apple phone. I will leave it there. Thank you.